Okay, welcome back, folks, to another edition of House Human Services. It feels that way today. This afternoon, we are going to hear from Abby Miller. Abby can describe who she is and what role she's had and currently has. This is related to H91 and in particular, uh, sort of how the interaction works around HUD and some of the stuff that she's done in the past and is currently doing. And Abby, I think we'll just make a quick run around the table so you know who you're speaking with from the legislative side of things, and then we go around the outside so you know who else is in the room. I'm Teresa Wood from Waterbury, Vermont, and I realize you're not in Vermont, so welcome to Vermont virtually. I also serve 3 other communities in central Vermont.
Ann Donahue from Northfield, also representing Berlin.
Good afternoon, I'm Dan Noyes. I represent Woolpit, Hyde Park, Johnson, and Belvedere.
Good afternoon and welcome. Eric McGuire, representative for Rutland City.
Hello, Doug Bishop from Colchester.
Hi, Todd Nielsen. I represent Brandon and Farmington.
Hi, I'm Zon Eastis. I live in Guilford and I represent Vernon as well.
Hey, Abby, Jubilee McGill. I represent Bridport, Middlebury, New Haven, and Weybridge.
And I'm Ray Garofano. I represent Essex and Essex Junction.
Lori,
Works Committee Assistant.
move all the way around the room.
Right, so Vincent presents and Sarah Kenny from Let's Forget.
Matthew DeGroat, Acton Circles.
Chelsea Phillips, Economic Services. I'm on Mendaris, also from Economic Services.
Great, thank you. And Abby, thank you so much for being here on such short notice. I appreciate it very much. Please tell us, one, a little bit about yourself, and then help us to understand this complicated system.
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's really my pleasure to speak to you today. So my name is Abby Miller. I have been working on homelessness, including being a student of the history, the root causes, and the entire historical trajectory within the United States. I, from 2007 to 2012, completed my PhD in studying specifically community planning and design of projects meant to serve people experiencing homelessness. And in that work, I really focused a lot on how people talk about and think about people who are experiencing that loss of housing and how that impacts what they plan and design. I then spent from 2012 to 2021, almost a decade at the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. In my first 2 years there, I was one of the team members on the initiative to end veterans' homelessness, and then spent the next 7 years in the Homeless Program Office, affectionately known as SNAPS, which is the Special Needs Assistance Programs Office. Since 2021 until now, I have been serving as a consultant to a variety of clients around the country, state of Oregon, California, Connecticut, as well as some nonprofits in New York City, where I am currently based, Vermont, of course. So that's where I've been. And I'll just say, while I was at HUD, I was one of the primary authors on the coordinated entry notice that established the requirements of coordinated entry. But I will note that coordinated entry is a legislative requirement established in 2009 by the Hearth Act. But I can certainly speak to the particularities of how HUD interpreted the Hearth Act in its regulations.
Thank you. That would be great.
Okay. Shall I begin?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So you can stop me if I am giving too much historical knowledge here. But I do want to go back to when the rise in modern homelessness really began in the United States, which was in the 70s. and then in a big way in the early 80s. The reasons for that are multiple. We experienced a mass loss of cheap lodging in most cities across the US during the period of the 50s into the 70s. The rise of habitability standards, zoning, and urban renewal really led to a loss of a critical housing stock that we really no longer have in the United States. These would be boarding houses, rooms for rent, and rooms for rent across a wide spectrum from, 5 cents a night to an actual weekly or a monthly way to rent. But this loss of housing, while it was certainly not spectacular, housing was cheap, which meant that it was affordable for people who lived very close to the bone. The US really underwent a lot of advocacy in the early 80s that culminated in 1987 with the Stuart B. McKinney Act. This was the first act that authorized federal funding to address homelessness. And that quickly became the McKinney-Vento Act. And it was really in HUD's charge and purview at that point to take this on and say, okay, what are we going to do with this money that has been appropriated for these authorized programs? And HUD really undertook internally, there was a pretty amazing collaboration between HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research, which was producing and also culling all of the research that was happening in the US about homelessness, so that as the federal government started to put programs and requirements in place, that they were doing so from a position of maximum evidence. What they quickly found is that there was a need for coordination across different programs that were operating in cities, towns, and rural areas. And what this looked like at the beginning was volunteer-run, often faith-based centers, church basements, etc. And these gradually became a more fixed and coordinated system that HUD first coined the term continuum of care in 1994. That was when they first required a consolidated application from communities to say, we can't just fund a shelter here and a transitional housing program there. We need to understand how you as a community are making decisions about how to address homelessness in your area. So between 94 and I would say up until 2009, the continuum of care concept continued to evolve. And with the reauthorization of the McKinney-Vento Act in 2009, which is really called the HEARTH Act, stands for a long name that I can't even remember. But the HEARTH Act reauthorized these monies and these programs. Sorry, reauthorized the programs. The APROPS brought the money. And the HEARTH Act really elevated the federal legislative requirements around what continuums of care had to do. And so it formed a single program that there were a lot of little legacy programs that had been piloted, they were funded, and there was an understanding that we need to bring these into a single system so that we can really look at it, get our arms around it, measure its performance, not just for an individual program, but across the entire system, so that we can understand better what is happening and therefore then take better action. So that 2009 authorization, the other thing that I'll say today that it did is require a coordinated access, it was called at that point. We now really refer to this as coordinated entry. And at the time, that was the terminology that was used. And coordinated entry is meant to do a few things. It's meant to standardize the experience and process, the experience of people who have lost housing and the process of making sure they get rehoused. It required prioritization of people based on need and vulnerability. And it required that the locality, whatever the continuum of care is defined as, which in Vermont, of course, you have two continuums of care, that you have a standard intake, assessment, and referral process to ensure that everybody who's coming through the system gets the same access to resources, with that caveat of there is a prioritization for folks who have higher needs. I am going to pause there and see where you'd like to take the conversation.
Well, I think that one of the things that, so one of the things that I think is important for the committee to understand is like, what are the required elements of coordinated entry? And what we're trying to figure out here, honestly, is developing an integrated temporary shelter program, and also ensuring that people who receive whatever form of temporary shelter, there's lots of different forms, but whatever form of temporary shelter, who are homeless, that they have access to coordinated entry, because one of the things that we've succeeded pretty well in Vermont in doing is that access to permanent supportive housing is done via the coordinated entry system, so rather than, a bunch of different individualized or who you can advocate best for, kind of thing at different housing authorities, people utilize coordinated entry as a referral source for permanent supportive housing, which I think, was the ultimate goal of, what HUD was thinking of. I think that really being, I guess, clear with us about what the required elements are, and then do you see variation in, from state to state in those required elements? And then what is the, I understand you're doing some work with Vermont, and it would be helpful to understand what's the kind of work that you're doing here? What kind of assistance are you providing here?
Sure. Let me start with the coordinated entry requirements. So the notice that was established in 2017 that I referenced earlier, it established quite a number of requirements. Back to some of them directly, well, they're all tied directly out of the Hearth Act, but they were iterative requirements that made sure that people understood parts of the system that were not really making sense. So there was a gap, I'll just say, between 2009 and 2017, where communities were told they are required to have a coordinated entry process, but not really how to do it. And so I would say in that 2009 to 2017 period is when a lot of the variations occurred. And during that time, the federal government was learning from a number of communities. One that stands out to me in this moment is Hennepin County in Minnesota. They were really great at figuring out how to make the system flow the way it needed to flow. And that, I would say, is beyond all of the requirements, which I could certainly go into them, but I don't know if that is going to be the best use of the time. Tell me if so. But I will say that the coordinated entry intention, and I think the intention matters because there is a spirit of the law and there is a letter of the law. And the spirit of coordinated entry has always been, how do we take all of the parts of the system from the beginning, when somebody first experiences a loss of housing, and what happens to them? Do they know who to reach out to? Is there any kind of marketing going on in the area to say, hey, you can call 211 or you can go here, so that people know where to go to get help? That's the first piece. And I would couch that in marketing. right?
Mhm.
The coordinated entry has to be open to everybody, and part of being open to everybody is making sure that it is marketed in ways that reach all of the groups that may be experiencing a loss of housing.
So can I just ask you a question about that?
Yes.
So what you just said is sounds actually a little foreign to me, in that and it could be just my interpretation. So I've always kind of like thought about coordinated entry in our experiences as something that's not necessarily forward facing to regular Vermont citizen who is homeless. I've thought about it as being a behind the scenes tool that the appropriate agencies who are working with individuals who are homeless and people looking to provide housing use. And so that's different. It's an interesting. I don't know to what extent we actually do that here in Vermont, to be perfectly honest, to say that this is a resource for you and you should be asking about how you can access this resource. I don't, and none of the testimony we received in Vermont speaks to it in that way. So that was a different take or understanding.
So this, I think, is a key variation point for a lot of communities. So if we look at the state of Connecticut, the way theirs is set up, they actually do run their access through 211, which makes it very easy to market. Call 211, the 211 operators understand what to ask you and where to direct you to. That is because Connecticut took an approach of coordinated entry beginning before somebody enters shelter. That decision allows them to provide diversion services, which could be landlord-tenant mediation, could be paying some utility arrears, could be having a conversation with grandma and saying, hey, what would it take for you to continue to have your grandson stay here? So that type of intervention, that decision was made so that they could do that kind of work. In some places, they do not begin the coordinated entry intake and assessment process until somebody's already in a shelter. It really depends on how the system is set up and how it's resourced. So if you are only working with folks once they get to shelter, that's probably because there isn't a whole lot to offer before that point. And in a lot of resource-constrained environments, such as Vermont, that is a pretty common decision that's been made.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here before you move on. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. With respect to that model in Connecticut and the use of 211, is the person calling actually entering the coordinated entry system, with an intake with the 211 person, or is the person at 211 actually just identifying other resources that would help keep them out of becoming someone who is entered into the coordinated entry system?
Good question. There is a first triage attempt by the 211 operator. And then if the resources or the guidance or the conversation doesn't advance that person's situation to something that's going to work for them, then they are referred to the hub that would be, when I say hub, I mean a regional body. So for you all, it's going to be the local coordinated entry processes, right? The 11 that you have around the state. In Connecticut, they have 7. So if that 211 intervention is not successful, which it often isn't, somebody often needs a deeper conversation and maybe some additional resources. So then it goes to one of those 7 hubs, depending on where that person is located in the state.
So the 211 is not themselves doing the coordinated entry. They're the pre-screen.
It's a bit of a pre-screen filter function.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's kind of how 211 works in Vermont. During the after hours and weekends, because they provide access to emergency shelter through an intake process, but it's not sort of the complete coordinated entry. Yeah, go ahead.
Abby, do they, I'm interested in that, do they do any data entry? You know, in Vermont, we use Clarity. Do they do data entry and kind of do that referral through their system?
They do. They do. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think
go ahead,
in
Asuna.
all
We have
in
one more
all of
question
the
on that.
oh sure.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, or if you want to finish your thought, if it's related to that, and then I can.
It's okay.
Okay. I am wondering if you see ways, or if you can give kind of examples of other states where there's more integration between in Vermont, we have our service providers and that kind of continuum, and state governments, and the administration and the state agencies. Are there examples of that you can provide? Is that working?
Could I just ask you to say it one more time, Jubilee? My wheels are turning, but could you just say that again?
Yeah. I mean, specifically when our task force and some, is a recommendation and things we've talked about, that we've heard testimony, it would be helpful is bringing our state agencies into the coordinated entry process, through data entry, and having, it's a great referral system. You can see where people have been referred and where they wind up, and helpful to have all of that in one system. And so I'm just wondering if that happens in other states, or variations of that.
Yes, I'm thinking. I think I'm going to
You haven't worked
continue.
with all states, or just any really. You're very familiar with our state, in your working on the strategic planning. Are there things you see that we could be improving, and really improving that coordinated entry and continuum?
I would say on the front end, there are a variety of reasons why somebody becomes homeless. One of the big factors is coming out of institutions, prison, jail, respite. Those I call feeders. These are feeders into homelessness because there isn't a good housing solution when people are discharged from these institutions. Foster care, also huge. When folks are just being discharged to a shelter, or not even a shelter, just discharged and, good luck. That becomes a huge problem for the state, because the homeless response system is not equipped in and of itself to be able to intervene in that process. It requires collaboration from the state agencies that are working with those populations and those institutions and systems to make sure that that discharge does not translate to homelessness. So I would say that for sure, in response to what you're asking. I'm thinking about Oregon, actually. The way that they are set up, they have a prevention, and primarily because the Oregon State Legislature has dedicated hundreds of millions to combating homelessness. And what they have done with that is they were set up largely the same way that Vermont is set up. They run their hubs through their community action agencies. But they're also, they're broken into a lot of different regions in the state. And rather than just continue to have the individual regions manage all that, the state recognized it had a role to play. And so when those dollars started flowing to the state agencies, they were setting up centralized prevention functions, intervening in the eviction process, and also intervening in the institutional discharges. That is, for me, a really good example of the state stepping into a leadership role coordinate and make sure that they're not exacerbating the problem, and ideally making it better.
Thank you.
And I call out community action agencies only as an example of how Oregon has done it. I'm not suggesting that model is any more valid than any other.
All things that we're considering here.
Yes.
So, I mean, you touched on, a lot of things under discussion.
And I
So-
will say that we focused a lot on the front end of coordinated entry, but
Mhm.
despite the name coordinated entry, it really is a process that goes all the way to housing.
Yeah.
So if we move into those parts, there is a persistent lack of resources for people who are experiencing homelessness. It's something that the federal government has continued to increase its investment over time, particularly with additional programs like the Youth Homeless Demonstration Program, which you all have one of those grants. They're trying to get at some of the population-specific factors, which includes coordinating with state agencies that work with those bodies, or excuse me, with those communities. But the pace of dollars is not keeping pace with the need. And that goes back to a housing problem. Across the US, and I was spending some time with Vermont's housing needs assessment before this, and it looks largely the way most states look. There were many more housing units being developed in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Starting in 2008 is when there is a pretty precipitous slide down from housing development before and after. And many states, including Vermont, have never recovered back to those pre-08 housing development numbers. So it has meant that as population has increased in the US, the housing development has not kept pace, and has created such a squeeze on communities. Additionally, with home sharing platforms, private equity getting involved in the purchase of multifamily units and single family units, it has only exacerbated the tightness.
Mhm. Wait, all of what you said is, obviously happening here in Vermont. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things, housing needs survey came out recently and, identified, it depends upon if you're looking at the high end, the low end, and whether it's service supported housing or not, but, tens of thousands of additional units being needed and, points to the same stuff that you were just speaking of. So, it would be great if maybe you could move to what is the work that you're specifically doing in Vermont? I understand you're doing some consulting work.
Yes. So I've been consulting with Vermont Balance of State Continuum. And with them, I first stepped in to support their development of their consolidated application to HUD for the 2024-2025 grant funds. Happily, Vermont was awarded a very interesting new project that I hope HUD eventually releases those funds and you're able to create. And all of the renewal projects were renewed through that and given cost of living increases. That has now translated to working on strategic planning and foundational work with the local housing coalitions in partnership with the Balance of State Continuum of Care and HHAB as the staff for the Vermont Balance of State. That work is looking like ensuring that these local housing coalitions, which I think we all know, are staffed by people who have full-time jobs otherwise, and are coming together in volunteer capacity to do that coordination and planning work. And the local housing coalitions need a baseline of understanding of what they are here to do. Now, this is a field that has very high staff turnover. So there is an ongoing socialization and education that has to be done both at the state level and in these local areas. It's always been that way, everywhere I've worked. And Vermont is no different. So the local housing coalitions, we are right now working on formulating a governance charter template that everybody can use. So there's some local variation, but at least everything looks, feels similar. We're also looking at how these local housing coalitions can make quicker decisions, can bring their resources to bear more quickly on what's happening in the local area, and more coordination and communication between the local housing coalitions and the Vermont Balance of State. Ideally, the balance of state with HHAV is setting the priorities that are the highest priorities for the state based on what you all are facing at large. And then the local housing coalitions are taking those priorities and saying, well, this is what they look like here. This is what they look like in the Upper Valley. This is what they look like in Rutland. Knowing that there's some variation on that, but really the purpose is to get everybody coalesced around the same priorities. So in that
Can
work,
I ask
we
a
are.
question about
Yes.
that, Abby?
Sure.
Is there, so, we've been working on this, a variant of this bill for a couple of years now. And one of the things that came out in testimony, particularly last year, we haven't heard as much about it this year, but, and that's the difference between the Chittenden County COC and the balance of state. And are you doing any work to, I hear, through informal sources that there's better collaboration, there's more consistency of term definitions and use of, I guess, similar data elements and understanding all of that. Are you involved in that work at all?
I have not been involved in that work other than observing that HHAV is working quite a bit with their Chittenden County counterparts. But
Okay.
there were, yeah.
Okay.
So just what I've observed.
All right. Thank you. I'm sorry for interrupting. I didn't know if
that's
that
okay.
worked. Yeah.
That's okay. So for the local housing coalitions, getting clear about what strategies look like at the local level and how they tie back to the statewide priorities, and that they're rooted in the data from that area. So one of the things that we're working on right now is creating from the state data, making regional gaps analyses so that people can look at it and they don't have to argue or engage in conjecture about what is needed, that they can actually look at the hard numbers and say, okay, for instance, we have this many families coming into the system or asking for assistance every month. We have this many units to actually temporarily shelter people in families, families with children. How do we close that gap? And in looking at it and asking those questions, it's not that the local housing coalitions will be the only entity working on that. It's going to be done in concert with the Balance of State, with OEO, who is operating the coordinated entry and the HOP program. There are high amounts of collaboration that need to happen to make these shifts happen. I think one of the benefits that you all have in Vermont is that you've been using hotel motel vouchers as a method of providing emergency shelter. Not only is it far more dignified for people experiencing homelessness, but I think there's a there is a flexibility with that kind of model that you're not needing to invest in brick and mortar shelters when situations are changing. They are in flux. So you have more people experiencing homelessness today than you did on this same day last year. But that doesn't mean that that will always be the case. So tapping into flexible uses of existing stock, like what you all are doing, is really commendable. Because it does allow you to make changes over time.
I think you're the first person that's told us that. To be perfectly honest, I'm just like, okay, maybe I might have to listen to that one 2 or 3 times. I mean, I think that's a helpful perspective, because, we are trying to figure out with, all states have limited resources. And, we heard from Vermont Housing and Conservation Board that, they could invest X amount of dollars in a shelter that might provide temporary services, or they can invest that same amount in permanent housing that could provide X number of units on a permanently affordable ongoing basis. And, that's obviously the preferred use of resources. And yet we have this sort of like struggle with, what some people view as inappropriate or excessive use. I'll say excessive use of hotels and motels for this sort of stopgap temporary situation. And I think that because temporary seems to be lasting longer than any of us would hope, we still are investing in further shelter development. And honestly, I don't know, and this would be an interesting question for you, based on your experience. Is there information out there on looking at a per capita basis, taking into consideration, poverty levels and stuff like that, the number of shelter beds that any particular population center should have?
I would say, so in my experience, and having built some of these tools in my time at HUD, we tend to think about a shelter bed as always in relationship with permanent housing. So depending on what I mean by this, let's say that you are developing a shelter that has 20 beds. If you anticipate those 20 beds, you say, okay, over the course of a year, we need to average 4 people using this same bed on their way to permanent housing. Then how many housing starts do you need to make that a reality?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you keep from just building shelter after shelter after shelter with no housing in sight.
Mm-hmm.
There's a ratio and a relationship between them. So
Makes sense.
I often say like a 1 to 4, right?
Mhm.
For every shelter bed, you're creating 4 units of housing. Also, just to delve into the voucher versus hard unit for a minute. So HUD COC programs are built on a voucher model, similar to how HUD's Public and Indian Housing Office does things, where it's largely Section 8 vouchers now. Federal government has been out of the business of developing housing for quite a long time. I think the last major development that was happening was in the 90s with Hope 6 projects. But even those were kind of around the margins. So the federal government is largely not doing housing development. They are providing vouchers. Those vouchers have to have a home to live or they can't be used. And that is the problem that we are in right now. There are vouchers available, there's money available, but there are no hard units to actually use those vouchers in.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a state, it's this balance of, yes, we may need to develop some shelter. We absolutely need to develop housing and make sure that there is a relationship between those two developments or those two development efforts.
Thank you. I think, are there, Abby, if there's any kind of like final wrap up, statements that you'd like to make, and then I'll just, ask folks if there's any final questions that they might have. I
Yeah,
don't see
I
any
think-
questions popping up, so,
Okay.
go for it in terms of, sort of like summarizing your testimony would be great.
Yeah. So I think there's one thing that I have not said, that I have not spoken to here, which is the nature of services in the homeless response system. HUD has largely funded housing interventions. HUD has two programs, Continuum of Care and the Emergency Solutions Grant. The Emergency Solutions Grant, or ESG, is very small. It is often pennies by the time it gets to the shelters who need it. And so states really have played that role of providing the funding for shelter. Because HUD is in the business of the housing side of it, that also means that the services, people have had to get very creative about how they put things together. So figuring out how to use Medicaid. But the short story here is that there are not, haven't ever been, certainly are not now, enough services to really deal with what is happening out there. And I think that that lack of resource can sometimes look like chaos. It can read like chaos, or like, but why do we have 5 different agencies all seemingly doing the same thing? They are doing the same thing for different people often. And when you look in those agencies, they are running short-staffed perennially. And so I just want to insert those comments as well, because I think that what can look like a shortcoming of service provision, I would say, is more a shortcoming of funding. And coordinated entry is no different. That it is, we're trying to create this process that people can move through, but it requires people who understand what's available, the resources that are available. There have to be resources for people to be connected to. And this all takes money, coordination, and will. So I wanted to speak on that. And what I would say to sum up coordinated entry for Vermont, I am sure that there are ways that things can be done more effectively and efficiently, because that is the nature of any process. There are always improvements that can be made. I would say, though, that coordinated entry as a whole is a process that has opened up access to more people than had access prior. It has made it less complicated for the people experiencing homelessness to move through the system, even alongside a feeling of things can get chaotic. Maybe I don't know where I'm going, but prior to coordinated entry, if you had 10 providers in a town, that individual who had lost their housing had to physically go or call every one of those providers and say, can I get on your wait list? And in the meantime, unclear.
Right.
And so we are living in a time of heightened coordination and planning that is needed. And there's also money that has to flow to the system to make it work. It has exposed some of the parts of the system that have never really worked very well. And I want to make sure that that exposure does not become the sort of painting of coordinated entry as the chaotic thing. It really has brought more process to the system. I think if those agencies and legislators that are trying to support the end to homelessness in Vermont can focus on the pieces that are going to make coordinated entry work, meaning getting prevention dollars on the front end that are available to people that get to them at the right moment. And then making sure that there is housing for those vouchers to go to at the end of the process, that makes the system move as it should. I will end on that point.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's helpful to have a perspective from somebody who has both worked at HUD and is working with other states and also has an understanding of Vermont system. So thank you for bringing that perspective. And in particular, the thing really was in your closing statements about don't be totally turned off by the chaos because it doesn't mean that things are not being done efficiently, even though we know that we can all improve. And I think that that's an important message for us as we try to craft something that will result in that improvement as we move forward. So really appreciate you taking the time on short notice to be with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Alrighty.
Take care.
Okay, folks. So we have Katie coming in in just a couple of minutes, and we are going to switch to H218. So I know that there is continued work happening on language and some refinement of stuff and numbers, and continue to work on that as we move through. But we'll take a brief 10-minute break, Lori, and we'll be back at 2.